Let's see, I don't see him yet, but anyway, I know he's registered. So let me tell a little bit about Phil J. Brannan. I met Phil in 1990 at the American Society of Meteorology meeting. We sat next to each other, and I saw this guy was a talkative, and I'm a talkative, so we clicked right away. And years later, we all ended up in Nashville. He was recruited by Dr. Moses to join the New Cancer Center. At that time, I think Hal was the chair of the cell biology. And so Phil came in 1994, but I had been here earlier in 91 at Meharry. We connected again. Phil was born in East Chicago, which is actually in Indiana. That's where he went to school. I was born in June 22, born in 52. Unfortunately, died at the age of 51 in June of 2004. During the time that Phil was here, he was a very passionate member of this cancer partnership, very dynamic researcher. He focused on the Kaposi sarcoma, cancer of the HIV. That was where he was trained. He received his training in NIH, actually also rotating through Dr. Robert Gallo's lab, actually before he left NCI. Well, Phil got his bachelor's degree from Fisk University here in Nashville. When he started Fisk University, he thought that he really wanted to get into revolution. So he quit temporarily, but came back to Fisk University, finishing 1995, and then went to 1975. Went to medical school at Tufts University. At that time, also he was one of the well-accomplished MD trainees of the class of 1980. I did residency at the Dana-Farber Institute in Boston, and also work as a NIH as a clinical investigator in the hematology component, all before he was recruited by Hal to Nashville. At Vanderbilt, he was one of the very nice, interesting, hardworking, faculty. He was always passionate about talking to minorities, trying to encourage them, motivate them, inspire them, and was a great mentor. Unfortunately, he was diagnosed with colon cancer, and he actually stood firm and tall, went through treatment therapy, and so forth. And I do remember about 3 weeks before his death, and I didn't know he was, approaching death that fast. Anyway, he called me one day and asked to meet him for lunch on West End. So we did, and we talked about many things and so forth. And I dropped him home that evening after our last meeting. So anyway, Phil made great impacts on everybody that he met. He's also recipient of many awards, including the Robert Wood Johnson Minority Medical Faculty Development Award. And I said that at the beginning of the cancer partnership, Phil played a major role in every aspect. And we were so devastated when we lost him in 2004. So if you hear that there's the Philip J. Brannan lecture, and that is the story behind it, and that is the fact, and that's why we decided to have this lecture after Philip Brannan, and it's given every year. Now, that brings me to the speaker of the day, Dr. Robert Winn, if I may call him Rob. So Rob is now the director of the Virginia Commonwealth University Massey Cancer Center. He's been a director since December 2nd of 2019. And he has been, actually, he's the first Black or minority cancer center director there. And actually, there are only probably a few in the nation, maybe not more than 2 or 3 or so, if I should say so. So he has a great deal of responsibility, which includes overseeing large number of faculty, about over 205 or so. He himself is a pulmonologist, so he carries out research in that area, and he has made tremendous scientific contributions. So a number of very high impact publications on cancer. He has actually shown great passion in terms of understanding, addressing health disparities, and working with communities in that respect. So he got his bachelor's degree from Notre Dame University, did the MD training at University of Michigan Medical School in Ann Arbor, and then did internal medicine at Rush Presbyterian St. Luke Medical Center in Chicago. And that's why also then he followed up with a fellowship in pulmonary sciences. And then we moved to University of Colorado, Chicago, Denver Medical Center, also worked there, spent a number of years there, and then was recruited back to Chicago, where he worked in the University of Illinois Cancer Center from 2015 to 2019 as a director. And not only that, he's also he was able to secure the U54 Cancer Fund partnership there in Chicago before he was recruited away to Virginia. Also in Chicago, he was a vice chancellor for community-based initiatives in terms of addressing disparities in working communities. And so you see that we have an individual who is highly accomplished academically, scientifically, and then also in community, and his passion in training minorities is unparalleled. He is an active member in the American Cancer Society, especially the minorities in cancer research, where he has served at the top of the leadership. So Rob, we welcome you today to give a talk at this retreat that we have today. And he's going to talk about cancer care in the 21st century. Rob, you are on.
Thank you so much. And Sam, as always, thank you for that background. And I will humbly try to do my best today to honor really that great legacy. I want to start off by sort of saying hello to many of my friends, you sure, Jennifer, Karen, many of you on this call I've known throughout the years and have enjoyed working with both at Meharry, Tennessee State, and at Vanderbilt. This talk is going to be a little bit different, but I want to just frame it for you the following way and just tell you some things to be completely transparent. Number one, I love science. Listen, if I could talk about RNA binding protein and protein methylation to you all day, I would, because if loving science is wrong, I do not want to be right. That's a fact. But the second thing is I understand, and over time, that particularly growing up where I grew up, where this was not a common language. Science is something that somebody else did, but not you. As I've gone through my path of graduating from Notre Dame and being inspired by Francis Collins, who was my genetics teacher back at University of Michigan, it dawned on me from that point as a medical student, how do I bring and how do I communicate the power and the impact and the importance of science to my community? More importantly, how do we bring our science closer to the community so it might better serve them? So it's with that spirit that I've actually moved through. Now, in 2019, I have to imagine, and we're going to talk about COVID because we can't get around not talking about COVID. But in 2019, when I was elected and selected VCU, the Massey Cancer Center directorship, it was clear to me that I definitely had pressures that I accepted readily. Imagine in 50 years that had been only one African-American director, Dr. Pendergrass over at Mayo, that was the director of an NCI designated cancer center. With my election and selection in 2019, December, I became only the second in that 50-year history. Now, on one hand, that's a cause for celebration. And on the other hand, that's a cause to take up arms and roll up our sleeves and get more work done. I believe that all of our science is not disconnected from your personal life. In fact, many people try to talk about science as if it has nothing to do with them. But I will tell you that even the Nobel Prize winners, some of us have gotten in, Alaska winners have gotten into doing what we do because of our lived experience. Either we were touched by experiences of cancer or other diseases in our family, and therefore our lived experience drove us to science. Martin Luther King once said he had a dream, and you all know that I have a dream speech. I do too. And let me just be clear that this talk is going to be based on the following dream. Number one, that I want to eradicate cancer off the face of the planet. Let that be clear for everybody. But number two, I want to eradicate health disparities wherever they exist. And I'm unapologetic about that. So it's with that spirit that I hope, you accept my talk, because this is going to be a talk that's going to be interesting. And I'm telling you up front, I'm going to challenge what we talk about social determinants of health. And I'm going to actually hope that we breathe another level of complexity when we talk about social determinants of health. Number one, so that we just don't get it confused with your everyday needs of living, right? Social needs versus social determinants. So I'm going to see if this works. And believe me, I get happy every time. So my son, I just saw him graduate this week from University of Illinois with his biomedical engineering degree. So I was super happy about that. But he keeps making fun of me every time I get to share my screen, and I'm happy about it. But I'm technologically challenged. Listen, so I'm going to try to get this. It looks like it's going to work again. Yeah, I know. Please bear with me. All right. So I'm going to start with a different kind of topic. I wanted to call this the cancer care in the 21st century. And I mean that because I mean that we are going to have to actually think about how we're going to do things differently in the 21st century than we did in the 20th century. And I believe the addition of neighborhoods and making communities not invisible as part of our big data, but making communities seen is going to be important. And understanding that history, regardless of whether we want to get rid of it or not, matters. I start off with this slide all the time, just to level set let you know where I am, that when values are strong, rules are unnecessary, but when values are weak, rules can tend to be insufficient. And I think we've seen that in our own lives. I start here as a reference point. I think this is an important reference point. 50 years ago, we were about ready to celebrate the war on cancer that was created by President Nixon and Ted Kennedy, who's pictured right behind President Nixon, who's center in this picture. He's right behind his right shoulder. These two men and others, and our scientists of the day, felt that by actually not only establishing a war on cancer, but establishing partnerships between NCI, the NIH, and academic medical centers that could partner in a way where you can deputize these cancer centers to really have more robustness around focusing on research, that we could make a difference. And I'd argue that the bedrock of this NCI designation was really founded on research. And I don't think anyone can argue that the research hasn't actually had an impact. I think that when you look at our last AACR health disparities sort of report that many folks on this Zoom actually had a part to do with, as well as folks like John Carruthers and others, we actually understand that we certainly are making progress in disparities. There's no doubt about that. The death rate, black-white differences between 1990 to 2016 certainly has improved. But I think we'd all argue that the truth of the matter is they're not zero. And when I think about disparities, if you look at certain disparities, in some cases, it's gotten a little bit better, or it's gotten somewhat better, but in some cases, it's not gotten better. Now, I want to remind everybody that when I think about disparities, I want to give you an example of just a paper that I came about in 2018, because I had been thinking a lot about disparities, and that frequently when we say rural, we tend to say we think of white, not understanding that when you think of Tennessee, places like Virginia, South Carolina, that many of our farmers are not Caucasian. Many of the farmers have been farming for decades. The families have owned these properties and have actually done it, and they're African-American and Latino. The other thing is, when we talk about sometimes disparities, it always comes down to almost a trigger where you're talking about urban underserved. So let me just, for example, give you a quick glance that in Norway, which is arguably probably one of the most homogeneous places on the planet, When you look at their data, you see an 8 to 10 year difference in life expectancy. I was doing a talk in Oslo, and so I wanted to make sure that, you know, I knew what was happening in the United States, but I looked at disparities there and initially figured that I probably wouldn't find anything, and found that not only a paper, but multiple papers were able to demonstrate that. That's a disparity. Now, the people in Oslo were surprised by that. And in fact, I said, when we talk about disparities, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Where you have a differences in life expectancy or other things allows you now to get under the hood, to start asking the questions of why, ultimately to come up with interventions and solutions. So for me, when I say I want to eradicate cancer off of the globe, I want to eradicate disparities wherever they exist as well, is in keeping. Now, it's true. COVID-19, when I started my cancer center tenure in December 2019, as only the second African-American ever to be a cancer center director of an NCI designated cancer center, I certainly had some things in mind. And then COVID hit. COVID, for many of us, and you've talked about that today, really has shown a light on many of the issues that had already been there. But let's not forget that many of these things have been around for a while. I point to Anthony Fauci and really the warp speed, because remember that we have certainly had miracles, just outright miracles in the context of what science could bring to the table to impact the health of people. And that I won't forget. But I also know that during this COVID period, that even despite those modern day miracles, science can sometimes fall short. And when it comes to disparities, some have rediscovered disparities, this health disparities, but I want to make sure that for those who have rediscovered health disparities, it's always been with us. W.E.B. Du Bois, and many of you have known this and seen the slides from some of my other talks, but I always go back to the center point, because the bottom line is that as we talk about health disparities and all this rest of these things, this has been already discovered and talked about and written about eloquently by our greatest social scientist of his time, W.E.B. Du Bois, that described many of the issues that we even have today. So stop playing as if your new discovery of health disparities and this new incremental sort of information, is going to change anything unless we implement. And as I've said once before, it's a little bit like having a diet. We've studied the heck out of diets and know that losing weight is good for you and all the health benefits. We also know that there's probably 10,000 more diets that if you committed to one, you'd lose weight. Let's not pretend that health disparities has not been studied and that we actually have approaches and mechanisms. We may need to dust some of them off that we know have worked in the 70s and 80s and 90s that were abandoned. And by the way, it's not lost on me. And many of you know the story of John O'Payne, who was on the launch of the eve of the Apollo 11 launch. He was the head, he was the NASA deputy director, and really the spokesperson. Dr. O'Payne had to deal with this really annoying guy, one of our civil rights leaders named Ralph Abernathy. And I don't know if you know the story or not, but Ralph Abernathy got a group of people to protest and to make all this issues about why are you going to space when you should be dealing with poverty. And I still remember to this day and have read and keep reading the work of Dr. Payne, that he said to Ralph, Reverend Abernathy, it's easier to put a man on the moon than it is to solve the issues of poverty and discrimination. Think about this. 1969, right at the time where Apollo 11 is going to launch, we're going to put the first man on the moon, and you have the person that's responsible in part for doing that saying it's easier to put a man on the moon than it is to deal with these issues. If COVID has done nothing else for me, it has made me bolder as I've gotten older in the context of understanding that we can't run away from this problem, that COVID in a weird way has given us an opportunity to do something about it. It's not lost on me that in Virginia, that in my, there are 133 localities, of which I have 67 of them. And in my 67, or my catchment area, I am well aware that we have the highest rates of cancer and the worst outcomes and the heaviest mortality of any of the other catchments throughout Virginia. And so I started thinking about, how am I going to do things different? When you go back to 1971, there was a big, bold, robust ideal of how are we going to conquer cancer at that time that seemed almost impossible to do. They understood the power of science. We understand that as we develop more drugs and more therapies, this is wonderful, but not everyone gets those drugs and therapies. We marvel at the immunotherapy divide. I mean, the immunotherapy and the checkpoint inhibitors and and all the rest of that stuff, and understand that there is an immunotherapy divide. We keep pushing for bigger and bigger data because the bigger it gets, the more confident you are with that. And yet, in our approach to bigger and bigger data, communities, in fact, have at points become invisible. So it's with that spirit that I started thinking that if we were going to reimagine the next 50 years of what a cancer center can do to impact communities, then I had to think differently. And how was I going to do that? So I went back in history. And I want to start with you with this line that you'll hear from me again and again and again through this talk. Social determinants are interesting to me because, yes, I'm a basic translational science. Yes, I'm an RNA binding kind of guy, protein methylation guy, Winn signaling pathway, but I also was the child of a 15-year-old mom that got much of his care through our federally qualified health centers and all the rest of that stuff as I was growing up. It became important to me that as I've been walking my way through COVID, as we all have, that I am now starting to look at social determinants anew. And that social determinants are the one thing that I know that represent both history and what's currently happening at the same time in parallel universes. I'll start with an example. The Federal Housing Act of the 1930s, which was put in place by FDR, a wonderful, amazing president during the time that wanted to get people back into their homes, was a wonderful concept. But the people implementing this concept, and again, this is, you know, if it makes anyone uncomfortable, I have to say that I can't apologize because it's history. And this is our collective history. And by understanding our collective history, I think we'll be able to move to the future. This is why I'm showing you this issue of called redlining. What was redlining? It was a deliberate attempt to be able to separate people so that they would not live in the neighborhoods. These people, specifically in the 1930s, were blacks versus whites. This is a picture of Richmond, circa 1935. And really what you're seeing is that the yellow spots and the red on this picture, portrayed on this picture, are areas that were considered to be non-desirable, and therefore you would not give a black person a loan to really get a house in the green or the blue area, but you would say that if you want to get a house, you can get it in the yellow or the red. Red lining. Yeah, got that. Good. We'll move on. Interestingly enough, and I'll go back to the slide just because we're going to talk about the East End. This area right portrayed right here to your right is the East End of Richmond, of which the East End had a house, something called at the time the Black Wall Street. Some people used to call Jackson Ward, which was on the East End of Richmond. Even folks referred to it as the Harlem of the South. In fact, some of the earliest banks, Maggie Walker and other things, established those things right here in the Jackson Ward on the East End of Richmond. It was a bustling city. It was a bustling part of town. As you can see, you know, with not only with the traffic jams back then, but even throughout the 1940s and 50s, this area of town was an area where you had doctors and lawyers and people who went to school, the Fisks, they went to Howard, they were educated, they had financial wealth even, despite the fact that they sat in the seat of the Confederacy. So why am I talking about this? Why am I talking about redlining? A federal program in the 1930s that unfortunately did not meet, I think, what FDR really saw was, but in its implementation was allowed, again, structure, right? And policies were allowed to divide people so that they would live in different areas. And then we had the second federal program. Now, some of you don't even think about this program, but this program also contributed to disparities. I don't know that the original intent, that anyone originally had the intent that they were going to completely harm people, but by the urban renewal processes of the 1950s, otherwise known in its another name that was more common during the 1950s and 1960s called slum clearance. This was the period where the federal government spent money during that period of time to essentially build, not my saying, but the quotes from the time, white roads through black bedrooms. I say this because, again, social determinants of health, the policies and the structures and the history that created currently now lives. When I say social determinants, it's clear to me that when I talk about social determinants of health, I'm talking about not only what's happening now, but the history, and they coexist. This process of slum clearance, if you will, urban renewal, which is the better way of probably saying it, or the more palatable way of saying it, led to the federal funding of interstate programs like I-95, which, interestingly enough, divided communities. In fact, divided the Jackson Ward so that the Jackson Ward, which was this amazing, robust community of people with banks and things, was isolated not only from the rest of the city, but the roads, interesting enough, started separating important parts of Jackson Ward. You may be saying, why is a cancer center director thinking about the issues of these federal acts of the redlining and the federal acts of the urban renewal program, or better known as the, or more commonly known as the slum clearance? Why is he? I don't get this. This is the new thinking. This is what the next 50 years must include. Not only a rigorousness around our basic science and our translational science, but a acceptance that those federal programs have led now to exposures of these communities in different ways that we must account for. Typically, when we talk about health disparities, sometimes when we talk about African Americans, we talk about their biology. I'm here to tell you, let's actually suspend for a second. Let's say race is a social construct and not biology. Well, then your zip code and neighborhood of association has an impact clearly on your biology. This is an awareness that as a cancer center, what's the big new robust idea? It's not that it's biology over to the right and population health over to the left. And well, they're kind of connected. Let's stop playing. That the increased rates, for example, of lung cancer that are now seen with increased PM 2.5, which are a little small particulates, are disproportionately affecting people of color in the United States. And interesting enough, new data actually saying that they have a stronger, a 25 to 30% potential increase of people getting lung cancer. Why am I saying this? Okay. I'm saying this because if you have now federal programs that have created these issues, structure, then by definition, one must actually embrace the fact that by putting people closer to highways with diesel fumes and all the rest of these other things, that we have disadvantaged a group. And in fact, need to probably stop talking about Blacks that inherently have comorbid diseases and Blacks just have this type of biology, and understanding that the very environment, the zip code and neighborhood of association that they had been born in also is contributing. And so our big data is not big enough And sometimes the big data gets so big that you don't actually see the communities. So I think this is a new era of being both immersed in big data and data sciences and in small area analyses. I think it's a time to dust off those methodologies around small area analyses and put those not in competition with big data, but in harmony. Why do I say that? Because I can go on and on. I can talk about the fact that many of these neighborhoods not only were exposed to increased diesel fumes and all the rest of this other stuff, not only had to suffer isolation then from, the grocery stores that they used to go to and the traffic flow that was in the Jackson Ward that used to happen, but I can point to many of the hazardous plants and many of the dumpsters and all the rest of these waste units were not put in the most glorious neighborhoods, but in these already disadvantaged and put more at disadvantage neighborhoods. This is an article from April 2021 talking about that the people of color breathe more hazardous airs from sources everywhere, and talking about, again, not just it's happening, but how did we get here? Sometimes it's reductionist as scientists, and I get the same thing as, when I'm looking at protein methylation, I'm looking at RNA binding, I'm going to forget all the rest. But the wonderful part about life is that as we're now talking about systems biologies, systems epidemiology, integrative epidemiology, we are finally starting to scratch the surface that where you live, the place and space matters, probably even more than your biology. And the integration and the knowledge of that, and how do we use that to be able to come up with issues of solutions, of interventions, will be the difference of how we treat cancer over the next 50 years. I don't even have to say anything about in addition to the plants and the roads, that the water and all these other things contribute to disease. Now, I'm almost in it because I also have this new concept that I want to just throw at you today. This is a little bit like, I got a song that ain't got no melody, by, Billy Preston. I want to sing it for my friends. Well, I got something that I just want to throw at you right now that's a little bit new, but I just want you to sit with me for the next couple minutes because I want to tell you, let's go back to this redlining as you sort of see. Let's go back to the East End of Jackson Ward of Richmond. And you can mirror in your head that red part and look at that blue part that's actually up north. I want to tell you that is meaningful to me because it turns out that in addition to that area of having more plants, hazardous fumes, waste sites, as we talked about, the highways that are cutting through neighborhoods and cutting them off from other things, and the isolation and stress and the loss of markets, and as a result, literally, of federal things probably trying to do something good, but with a bad outcome. This is now the East End of Richmond in 2021 versus what we call the West End, which is where the blue and green were. As you can see, and I'm going to get to this, that not only do we have the diesel and the exposures, but there's also less green space. Now, again, many of you are sort of saying, God, isn't Rob a cancer center director? He sounds like a public health guy. Why is he what is he doing? What is he talking about? Gilpin Court, Jackson Ward. Just visualize the paper. On your left is the East End, and this is the playground on the bottom of the East End of Richmond. This is most of what the playgrounds look on the East End of Richmond versus the West End, which was the area, again, the green area, the blue area, where people were allowed to actually buy homes. Interestingly enough, you can look at the trees and the vegetation. Why am I making the point that social determinants of health don't just exist now, but exist also as a history lesson? So it's both history and the now. It's because if you don't understand that, we wind up only taking half of the problem and not really be coming up with solutions and policies to address issues in the future. Why is that important? I'm gonna throw something at you. Most of you probably know this already, so this is probably old news to you all. But for me, it's been a fascinating trip to actually understand that urban heat islands are here. Now, I took Baltimore because, again, My grandfather was from Alabama, was a smart guy, said, you know, wherever you go, don't go in nobody's house talking about they talk about their dirty laundry, talk about somebody else's. So I'm gonna talk about somebody else's. But in Baltimore, for example, this is an area called Franklin Square, down to the left, bottom. And as you can see, Franklin Square is one of the heaviest hit places in Baltimore as far as poverty, as far as stress, all these other things. Pictured above is just typical suburbs that were right around Franklin Square. And then there, just to show you, when we talk about renovations in new areas of town that are up and coming, where the new young people are going, the new professionals, they live in a place called South Baltimore. I'm going to talk to you about these urban heat islands, because these urban heat islands aren't just you get hotter. It turns out they too contribute to chronic disease. Again, the past echoing and impacting the now. Yeah, the acts of both the Federal Highway Act and the redlining, right? Things of the past that resulted in certain structures and policies impacting the now is important to understand fully. These data show that, and again, I'll end up quick because I know I may be running over time. So let me just go through this quickly, that talk about the association of heat and income in Baltimore, but these heat maps can go for everywhere else in the country. We actually can generate these things, and they have been generated, where you talk about the hottest spots are also in the poorest areas. So if you look here at Franklin Square, it is probably in one of the hottest spots, but you look at what Franklin Square, you talk about income being 2,000. So the greener, the more money you make, that makes sense, right? And the less green, the less money, it's one of the poorest areas. I found that fascinating because it also, whether you're talking about places in Birmingham, Alabama, whether you're talking about places in Dallas, and Chattanooga, Tennessee, and everywhere else, you can see that from the old days, really, from the old days, and this is some stuff from Plummer and Popovich, from the old days, and there's some other data that I can share with you, that from those blue and green areas, from redlining, and those yellow and red areas from the 1930s redlining, that now over time, you have a difference in temperature. You'd say, what the hell? Right, because remember, in the areas that are the blue and the green, those are the areas where trees were valued, where vegetation were valued, where the lawns were valued, right? Where they were able to actually keep those things. So now you have canopies of trees, as I've showed you before, and all the rest is versus the Franklin Square or the Gilpin Court, where they have now had, in some cases, a ridiculous raise in temperature of not only 1 degree, but in some cases 5 to 7 degrees. And you sort of say, well, what difference does that make? It turns out that the environment that is, from the concrete and all the other things, and the lack of vegetation, lack of green space, are literally directly contributing in some cases to disease. This is a new cancer center. This is the ability to not talk about the basic science or the population science or the community science. It is, or talking about genomics and phenomics. These are the missing omic, and I call that the community omics that we need to pay more attention to if we're really serious about eradicating cancer and health disparities. Now, I'll end with sort of saying that traditionally, when we talk about social determinants of health now, we talk about upstream determinants of health, and we talk about the downstreams, that academic cancer centers are mostly focused on fundamental research downstream. Why? Because I think, as Dr. Payne actually said about NASA, we focused on that because it was easier to focus on the downstream factors than it is to focus on the history that created the social determinants of health and these upstream factors that are occurring today. It moved me and continues to move me that the head of NASA, when he meets one of our great civil rights leaders, would tell him it's easier to put a man on the moon than it is to deal with this. I believe that we have to shine the light back on us as scientists, academics, and as cancer center leaders. And are we, just like Dr. Payne from NASA, focusing on these things because it's easier to focus on these downstream issues than on the up. I say if COVID has not taught me anything else, it's we must find the courage to tackle the big issues of the day. And this big issue of bringing together the discovery, implementation scientists so that we can do good for our neighborhoods matter. We need to pay more attention to the zip code neighborhood of associations. This is just a picture. Again, I was going to go back. I'll just be quick that there's the same redlining that actually happened in Chicago. We know on the south and west sides of town that this is where most of the African Americans and poor people would live. Bottom line, we also know on the south and west sides of Chicago, if you had the highest obesity rates, highest hypertension rates, worst outcome for cancer, it's on the south and west side. We know that there's a 16-year difference just 4 miles away. This picture is on the loop is 85. The life expectancy is 85. This is taken from obviously before COVID. This is where the loop is where Keanu Reeves or Beyonce would be hanging out when they went to Chicago. But only 4 miles away from that, there's a place called West Garfield Park. 4 miles now, mind you, which is a 16-year difference of life expectancy. And then 8 miles south of the loop, there's a 30. Now, wait a minute. Before you actually sort of say, well, Rob, come on, man, violence is something that's happening in Chicago. We looked, this is with work that's done with Steve Wolf, and gun violence and all the rest of that is negligible. Negligible. So we're really talking about, again, that structure, the zip code and neighborhood of association, and the impact on the biology of the people living in those areas. So again, we've had great run with genomics. We've gone that. I mean, we've made some great progress in that. We have made great progress in phenomics, but we are missing one of those omics. The omics of community, the context, the built environment, the conversations around obesogenic environment as well as structural stress are rarely, if ever, brought up. And I believe if we're really going to make this is a modification of Harold P. Freeman's famous sort of recognition of the disconnect between discovery and implementation. We are certainly enamored with discovery because just like Dr. Payne, it's easier to do that. But we must be focused on the implementation. And I'll even modify Dr. Freeman's slide and says that in addition to that, we also have one other bridge to cross, and that's the implementation from the academic zone to the communities. I'll give you an example why zip code and neighborhood matters. These two sisters, they grew in the same town, from the same home, under the same circumstances. They grow up, they move apart. Now in the 1960s, we would say, yeah, that's great, right? They're genetically the same. They're genetically the same. However, one moves to the Gold Coast. That is the Loop area where I talked about, very affluent, has lakefront gyms, parks, all the rest of these things. During COVID, they were able to go outside, et cetera, right? The other moves to Moline, which is a high rate of poverty, high rates of breast cancer, lack of fresh foods, lack of hospitals, and interesting enough, lack of really outdoor green spaces. My question for you is, if they both got cancer, do they get the same treatments? Now, in an age of precision medicine, one might argue, well, I don't know, right? In the 70s, you would say, of course, they're genetically the same. But if one believes that the microbiome, epigenetic, and these things are important, that the food you eat and food you have access to are able to influence your gut and therefore influence your very DNA, that might improve your lot if you live somewhere else, and lessen your lot or increase your risk of getting cancer if you live somewhere else, matter. In the 1970s, you might say, well, of course these two girls will grow up. They grew up in the same, they're genetically the same. They're twins. We now know that that is not exactly entirely true. And that their lived experience in their place in space might allow one to respond better to a certain type of drug than the other. That's precision medicine. Precision medicine isn't just getting your genomic signature. It's also understanding that the genomic signature exists within communities as well, and linking that community data to the genetic data will be powerful and allow us to, I believe, come up with different interventions. Bottom line is, COVID has also taught me that we need our community more than ever. when the libraries were closed, when the schools were closed, when other nonprofits could close, it turns out that I had one thing that was not closed, and that was the clergy, faith-based leaders, and other community members that were out there with people even during COVID. As a result of that, we created what was called Facts and Faith Friday. This is with the co-founders, Rudine Mercer Haynes, who's a community champion, and Pastor Todd Gray from the Fifth Street Baptist Church, one of the oldest churches in the Richmond area. We three got together and said people were not getting information. And by the way, people were not trusting scientists or doctors. In fact, we had a little survey within the area that said that there was less trust for doctors and for scientists than there was for their neighborhood pharmacist or for their neighborhood barber. We got together and decided that every week, the commitment of the Cancer Center and the Cancer Center director would be, I would have weekly meetings with this group of now over a couple thousand faith-based leaders to give them the best data that I could internally and externally, not so that they can just share it with their congregants, but they can share it also with their communities. Bottom line is, if I haven't learned anything through COVID, is that we must see through different eyes, that social determinants of health are not just one-dimensional, that the community is absolutely necessary, and that we must continue to build bridges between discovery science, the connectedness to implementation, and from the implementation science into the community. And at the end of the day, I just wanted to give thanks to my grandmother, who has always taught me that at the end of the day, no matter how smart you are, words are, and I found out that it comes from Theodore Roosevelt, that people don't know how, people aren't impressed by how much you know until they know that you care. And I think that in some ways, our communities and our academic centers, the change in the next 50 years is how do we go from knowing a lot to having our communities know that we care. And that takes grace and humility, of which we will bring that grace and humility to these next 50 years. So I hope I haven't overstayed my welcome. I will tell you that I'm more than cautiously optimistic about the future of what these next 50 years are going to be in reimagining what cancer centers can do and the type of things they can bring together and converge that have not been able to be done before. But I say, why tackle the little problems? In fact, I'll end with Daniel Burnham, who sort of said, when someone asked him a question, and when he once sort of said, why do something small? Because small things will only get small results and typically isn't even done and finished. Let's do big things, because big things will stir the heart of men and women. I say the big thing is eradicating not just cancer, but health disparities. And for that, I believe that with you all, through these mechanisms of U54s and through the other mechanisms coming through the NIH, we'll have the tools, we'll find the courage, and we'll get it done. So with that, I'll stop my talk and just say thank you for putting up with me. Very much appreciate your inviting me here. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Winn. That was an amazing talk. Let's do big things. And with that, I'll ask if there's any question from the chat, or we can unmute if there's any question or shout outs to Dr. Winn.
And I have to apologize. I know y'all was like, hey, is it Sunday already? I know. Spirit just moved like that. I can't help it.
Rob, anytime you speak, I literally have to turn my camera off because I'm jumping out of my seat. So thank you so much. I mean, you touched on so many things that those of us who have been doing real community engaged work understand. Like even the importance for me being new to Nashville, of understanding the historical context of care and also the environment, right? So it will allow us, part of community engagement is understanding that history so that you don't make the mistake of putting a bridge that, while might be iconic to some, actually represents the decimation of a Black community to others, right? It will help avoid those issues by understanding the history. But I think it's also important, as you said, to think about the future. And one of the reasons why I left one of the institutions I was at in the past was because they kind of were speaking out of both sides of their mouth. They're like, we want to engage Blacks in research, or we want to do this for the community. But then they were like, oh yeah, but they don't have the right kind of insurance, right? Or other things. Talk a little bit about that from a cancer center director's perspective. How do you kind of bridge the fact that it's still a business, you still have to be fiscally responsible, with this notion of really truly meeting the community where they are, if they can't walk through the door?
Yes, I think that first of all, I want to, I have so many champions of people who I just admire, Jennifer and Karen and Yashir and Sam, that, I am just, I'm just tickled pink to sort of be here. But I want to say that that's one of the very reasons why I went to VCU Massey. VCU Massey historically has been a safety net hospital. And I started thinking to myself, a safety net hospital with a CTSA and an NCI cancer center. Now that could be interesting. And in fact, what I'm trying to do, the little experiment that we're trying to do is to show that if it could work, and I know that of the NCI designated cancer centers, there's only 2 safety net hospitals, and we're one of them, and I'm proud of that. So the bold experiment that I want to do is to show that you can be fiscally solid and do good without losing your shirt. And the truth of the matter is we are now actually working in an interesting way with federally qualified health centers in a way that even the FQHCs didn't know they had additional resources for. So we are actually starting to put together, I never think financially, but I got some really crackerjack financial people now. And we're starting to show that we're making, even throughout COVID, we've actually were able to, by partnerships with Capital Area and some other things, come out on the other end by actually seeing patients who most of us would say you ain't got the right insurance. And by the way, this is my grandmother coming back at me and my grandfather, but more, and I have to say Notre Dame, folks at Notre Dame, Father Walter, Father Austin, who gave me who saw something in me before I saw it in myself. And I was not going to be a doctor. In fact, that was not my goal. Oh no, all I wanted to be was I just wanted to go back and work for GM because I knew them folks made some money. So I was the first in my family ever to go to college. So I was like, listen, I don't really care what degree you give me, just I got to work at GM. So that's how true story, started off in engineering. It was Father Walter, Father Oster, who came to me and said, son, you ain't no engineer. And so I'm always grateful to folks at Notre Dame for putting me on this path. But as a result of that, I've been dedicated to figuring out exactly what you're talking about, Dr. Wingfield. How does one take care of the folks we know we need to take care of? In fact, there's an article, and I think you've heard me talk about this one that was in Political once. It said, while a certain clinic, a certain health system got rich, the blocks away, the neighborhoods were mired in poverty. I don't want that. These cancer centers in 1971 were not set up to exclude, they were set up to eradicate cancer. Over the next 50 years, we do have that, figuring that out, and it's tough. And I'm not going to say that we have all the answers, but I can say that we are starting the experiment of how do we actually take care of those who need? How do we make sure that the people directly in our community, like literally blocks away, independent of their insurance, have access to us? That is what I believe this next 50 years is going to be the struggle of. And I welcome you and others around how we're going to figure this out, because we will.
Hello, Dr. Winn. This
Hello?
is Dr. Clayton. I'll put my video on. I want to personally commend you and congratulate you on such a powerful presentation on the historical legacy and the contemporary consequences of federal policies that have led to these social determinants that we see now, which contribute to cancer disparities and all health disparities. So I guess my question, I'm so excited. I'm almost like Dr. Wingfield. I'm like shouting right now. It's like, how do we shift the paradigm from where we've been and where we are to where we need to be as it relates to policies and those kinds of things that have contributed to and continue to contribute to disparities in cancer and all other illnesses? I'm going to stop there with the question, but I just can't wait to hear your answer and continue the dialogue after today.
I think that Dr. Pete Paul and Dr. Wingfield and I have been talking a lot about how does VCU Massey and Vanderbilt and Meharry get down after this and continue to work. I'm looking forward to those conversations. And Dr. Clayton, I just have to give a shout out back to you. Because I know you were one of those people. Look, I know you were one of those people that's been in the trenches for real,
Absolutely.
for a very long time. And I know everybody else know, but I want to know that it's not lost on me that I know you too. So anyways, I'll just, so here's what I will say. How do we start? This is what I mean by reimagining what we can do over the next 50 years. We have a platform. In part, we also know that cancer centers are not just supposed to come up with new discovery, but we have two other things we're supposed to do, right? Paradigm shifting treatments and policies.
Yes.
It's written. It's not like we're going to do something that we ain't supposed to do. We're expected to do it. I'm just sort of saying that over the next 50 years, how do we actually now take the time? And I got it, the discovery sciences. Believe me, I love science. I love when experiments work out right at my bench. But I also know that, and I've been getting my basic scientists to understand that, and in fact, I'm writing a book chapter now about basic science and its contribution to disparities. And it's taken a very long time to do that, and it's been quite painful, but understanding that, by basic science, if you're basic science and anytime you're doing something that's applied, you are impacting society. You have to stop fooling around that. When you look from your Petri dish and you start looking at where you're going to publish your findings, you've made a social impact. You may publish in a journal or you may publish in an area where no one will have access, particularly not some Ronnie from the barbershop. So let's stop playing that there is this separation between basic, and basic has always been, you're answering probably even questions from your lived experience. So quit playing. So what I'm asking other cancer centers to do is to not make this an or. I'm not talking about fighting over crumbs. I'm talking about expanding the resources, expanding the dollars from the NIH, expanding the dollars federally, expanding the dollars statewide so that we can do more of this work. I don't want them to pit us against one another. To pit someone against that, it's either basic or it's just other stuff around community. That's crazy. The other thing is, we ain't gonna do things differently unless we get different people at the table. Now listen, I'm just being straight up honest about that one. I'll be honest, I had an old job back in Colorado where I was their first African-American dean ever, but I was the dean of admissions. It mattered to me that we actually had women in our class because they bring about a different perspective at the table. It should also matter to us that we bring different races and places and people from different places to that table, because you get now a cancer center director who grew up in those hoods, who is saying, my science is not just all about RNA and DNA and protein methylation. We're also going to do some things around policy because I took my care from that and understand the good and the bad. By having different people with different lived experiences who are your cancer center directors, I honestly believe that we will start answering and asking different questions that even matter to the community that we can solve together. Second, we're going to have to, not only do you have to have the workforce, but we need to stop, quote, just having people at the table. Look, y'all, centerpieces are also at the table. Now, I hate to get all real with y'all. And, this is why Karen's probably like, listen, this boy, having Dr. Winn come up on a Saturday, y'all probably should have picked a Friday, probably should have squeezed him in between. But listen, here's the deal. Having community at the table sounds like this. Centerpieces of flowers are also at the table. They're beautiful, and everyone watches them. And at the end of the meeting, what happens? Those centerpieces are put to the corner and you go on about your business. Stop making people put them at the table. Let's make them part of that table, right? That there's not just, I'm going to include, I'm not going to engage you, I'm including you. We need to have better representation, I think, from community voices in all aspects of our cancer center. So I know that's a long-winded answer, and I got some more, but I'm gonna stop right there because, I think that for time's sake. But
thank
we
you.
have some things that we can do together. And I'm looking forward to working with Dr. Pete and Paul, Dr. Wingfield, and Sam knows I want to work with the folks at Meharry and TSU to figure out how we can actually solve some of these big problems.
Thank you so much. Powerful answer also.
Thank you. There's a question here in the chat that I also want to get to. How do Black and Brown people prepare now for unintended consequences of today's policies?
Yeah, and I would sort of say that that's going to be for all of us, independent. I mean, there are policies that were actually put in place by the other administration that impact us that some we don't even know yet. I think that how do we prepare for it? I think that to be vigilant about of getting news from more than just your social media. I know I know I just said a bad word. Because everybody loves the social media. I know I just said a bad word, but I think that there is much more. I've been trying to promote here at VCU Massey this effort of high tech and high touch. Well, high touch also means getting with your legislators. It means being much. So here's a crazy thing. Virginia was the only first state in the country to put faith-based leaders under the 1B. You know why? Because I and those faith-based leaders and other people from the Cancer Center recognize that the people that were giving the last rites and the people that were doing all this stuff weren't just funeral home directors, they were the faith-based leaders, and yet they were uncovered. So we really were advocating with our government, state government. I think involvement more in state government and involvement more with your district leaders and your aldermen and your councilwomen and councilmen matter. And in fact, to be quite honest with you, to do that, one of the things we're doing, I know this sounds crazy, we are now actually not just creating a catchment, but we create what we call now health districts. That is, for every alderman or every district we have, or every councilwoman, we have a snap of their cancer health so that they know their incidence, their prevalence. And for example, Chicago, 50 wards, we would have Ward 20, we would be able to say to that alder person, listen, you have 3 times more prostate cancer people dying than they do in the United States and in the rest of Illinois. What are we going to do? It turns out that it isn't that our policy people like our senators and state reps and don't want to do anything. They actually have been honest with me and saying they've never gotten the right information. So let's be more proactive. The reality is academics were smart, but we can't push policies without the folks in government. And I know, we have tended to say, let's not get involved with them, but they're looking at us and saying, let's not get involved with these folks over in science either. That's crazy. It takes all of us. And so we're having a new model where we really are starting to engage our government in a different way than the Cancer Center had previously. And I think it will result in some positive effects. So stay tuned.
And Dr. Winn, I just wanted, to say to Leah also, one of the things that I think is important is to do true community engagement up front, right? Like Dr. Winn said, having the community as an invitation, open invitation, that they're part of the conversation, not that centerpiece, is critical, because what's happening now is going to impact the community over time. And unless we're there, it's going to just be one of those public outreach things. Oh my goodness, all of a sudden there's this issue. Let's try to reach out to the community now. No, let's get them at the table. Let's have them participate now. While we know these structural barriers exist.
That's right.
So it's important to really do true community engagement and not the helicopter research that is so standard to most cancer centers.
And you know what the funny part is? I'm telling all my basic scientists that when they talk about COE, they have to talk about COE. Now, why? My goal, when I've done this right, is that if I do this right, we will have input from the community that helps refine the scientific question of my basic scientists. That's what I'm shooting for, that I have so much community input and that it's actually directed and it's shaped and it's structured and it has these avenues where their presence will help either define a question, scientific question that we weren't doing before, or they can refine the science that my scientists are actually asking. That's what I'm shooting for. So, and we're looking for examples of that. I think I have early examples, early wins, no pun intended, of that. And we're looking forward to expand that over time.
Awesome. Is there one last comment or question?
And
Dr. Reed,
I have to apologize. I tried my best not to get all hyped up. I literally did not drink my coffee this morning because I did not want to get hyped up, but to no avail. I'm sorry.
Dr. Winn, I just want to say thank you because I think all of us could actually stay on all the way through tomorrow and into Monday if we could keep getting some of your expertise and help with our bigger strategy. So, wow, kudos for the big inspiration you've given us all.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right.